Hello and welcome everyone to your first online music theory class with myself, Mr. Hardy. What we are going to be talking about today is, you guessed it, music theory and how music theory applies to learning a new instrument, how it applies to getting better at an old instrument, how it applies to singing, how it applies to everyday life as a musician. Most importantly, we're going to be discussing how music theory is essentially a universal language. So, talking about music as a language. Now, living in Canada, most of us, our first languages are either French or English, and we've learnt these languages through listening to our family, through listening to our friends, gradually picking up words here and there, then eventually putting them into full sentences, and then gradually being able to have full conversations, then eventually being able to read and write this language. Now, music is no different, except instead of calling it English, we call it standard notation. Now, standard notation, just like every other language, has a certain alphabet. Now, the alphabet within standard notation, how we read music, only has 7 letters. These letters are A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Now, there's only 7 letters in the musical alphabet, but the thing is, it doesn't stop there, because those 7 letters can repeat themselves over and over and over again, and they can go in all sorts of different orders. So it doesn't always have to go through A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Go C, F, G, B, A. And we assign different pitches to each one of these notes. Now, I'll talk about that in a second once we look at putting these notes or putting these letters on the staff itself. So the staff is essentially what we read musical notes off of, or notation off of. So just like we can read stories out of a book, we read songs off of the staff. Now, the staff consists of 2 main parts. We have 5 lines and we have 4 spaces. And we always count from the bottom to the top. So that's again 5 lines, 4 spaces, always. Now, looking back at our musical alphabet that we looked at previously with our 7 letters, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, we can start assigning letters to both lines and spaces. So again, here's our standard notation alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all right? And we can take those letters and then we can start putting them on the staff. But this is where it gets a little bit interesting. Now, before we start writing music or putting notes on our staff, we first have to assign the staff a clef. Now, there are 2 main clefs that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the treble clef and the bass clef. Now, essentially what a clef does is it tells the player how high or how low they are going to be playing. So this starts to deal with the word known as pitch. Pitch in music is defined as the highness or the lowness of a note. So, for example, we can have a note that sounds like this, which is really, really high in pitch. Or we can have a note that sounds really, really low, which sounds like this, which is known as a low pitch. So again, high pitch, low pitch. So the next question to ask is, what do clefs have to deal with pitch? Well, different instruments have different ranges. Now, some instruments can have a high range or some instruments can have a low range. So if your instrument has a low range, such as like a bass or tuba, you're going to be playing off of the bass clef. If your instrument has a higher range, such as like the flute or guitar, you are going to be dealing with the treble clef. So again, the treble clef deals with high-pitched instruments with a high range, such as the flute, the guitar, and even the clarinet. And when looking at the bass clef, we are dealing with lower ranged instruments. So low ranged instruments or low pitched instruments can be the trombone, it can be the bass guitar or the double bass, which is a stand-up bass, or it can be the tuba. So again, the bass clef deals with low-pitched or low-ranged instruments, and the treble clef has to deal with high-pitched or high-ranged instruments. So let's just recap briefly. Music is a language. The language that we speak in music is called standard notation. And the alphabet that we use in music is just 7 letters long. A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And again, these letters can move in a lot of different directions, and you can manipulate them to be in essentially any order you want them to be in. So it doesn't always have to go to A to G. It could go C, E, B, F, D, so on and so forth. Next, music is written on a staff. A staff consists of 5 lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 4 spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, before we look at how we put music or how we put notes on the staff, we first have to assign a staff a clef. And again, I've looked at 2 clefs, which are the treble clef and the bass clef. The treble clef deals in high-pitched instruments. The bass clef deals in low-pitched instruments. Alright, so now we're ready to actually start naming the notes or putting notes on the staff. So, if you look at the beginning of the staff, I've chose to draw a treble clef. Now, the treble clef will dictate specific pitches on different lines or different spaces. Now, what's really important to know when naming notes is that when you are naming notes on the treble clef or the bass clef, they are fixed positions. Now, what this means is that if I were to draw a note on this line, or if I were to draw a note on this space, it will always be named one note name. So again, those 7 note names are A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Those are my 7 choices. So now in my treble clef, this note is, if I were to draw a note here, this note is a G. If I were to draw a note here, this note is a C. Now, you're probably going to ask yourself, how did I know that, or how did I get there? Well, in the treble clef, this is my breakdown of notes. On my lines, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines again. So I have an E, G, B, D, and an F. Again, this is fixed position, so that means that if I were to draw a note here, that's always going to be an F no matter what. Or if I were to draw a note here, this will always be a D no matter what. In my spaces, I have F, A, C, and E. So again, if I were to draw a note in this space, that will always be an E no matter what. Or if I were to draw a note here, that will always be an F no matter what. But the thing is, I'm sure some of you might have noticed that I have an F up here and I have an F down here. Well, just as I was talking about before, these 7 letters repeat themselves. So as I'm moving up the staff or moving down the staff, I still follow this alphabet. So if I start at A here, as you notice, I'm going to go space, line, space, line. I go A, B, C, D, E, F. If I were to draw a note up here, that would be a G. Alright, so now that we've discussed how to name the lines and the spaces in our treble clef, you're probably asking yourself, well, that's great. I know that these letters I can put on these lines and these spaces, but what does that have to do with playing music? Well, when we start looking at actual music, which looks something like this, you'll notice that there are no letters associated with these notes, okay? So we just have our note heads here fixed on either a line or a space as I move up and down the staff. But the great thing about reading music, and probably the easiest way to understand this, is that when I'm looking at these different pitches or these different note names, the lower that I am on the staff, the lower the pitch is. So just like I talked about before, with the bass clef dealing with really low pitched instruments and the treble clef dealing with higher pitched instruments, when we're looking at the individual staff itself, just like any instrument has a range, that range deals with low notes or high notes. So this is where we start looking at the range of our instrument or the range of notes. So the lower the note is written on the staff, the lower the pitch. Or the higher the note is written on the staff, the higher the pitch. So when we look at something like this, we're going to have to be able to name each one of these notes, give it that letter name that we looked at before, and be able to recall that letter name and then put that onto our instrument as fast as we can. Now the quicker that we get at naming these notes, the quicker that we're able to start putting that on our instrument. So let's look at this. The fastest way to recognize notes or pick up our note recognition is to start assigning different acronyms to each one of these letters. So for example, when we look at our lines, we have E, G, B, D, F. Well, the easiest way to remember this, and I'm sure some of you have heard this from me or someone else before, but we can look at this. E, G, B, D, and F. Or we can use this saying, every good boy deserves fudge. If we look at our spaces, we have F, A, C, E, which if we look spells face. So when we're naming notes on the lines, we can use every good boy deserves fudge, E, G, B, D, and F. For naming notes in the spaces, we can use F, A, C, E. So let's use this for a second. I'll bring this back. So when I'm looking at notes and I'm naming notes on the staff, again, I'm always counting from the bottom to the top in regards to my lines and spaces. So if I look, this first note is on my 1, 2, on my second line. So if I look up here, I go 1, 2, I know that this note is a G. My next note, I notice that it's on a line, so I start from the bottom again. I go 1, 2, and 3. If I look up here, 1, 2, 3, well, that note is a B. And I go through this process until I've named all my notes. Now to begin with, especially as a beginner and you're reading music, a lot of you will have to write the note names underneath the notes, but eventually you'll get to the point where you're able to go G, B, D, C, D, E, F, E, D, B, A, C. So I was able to do that because I've read music for a while and I'm able to fluently look at this and then put it onto my instrument. So that's our next step, is after we're able to read these notes, which is great, okay, but the faster we're able to read these notes, the faster we're able to speak it, put it in the language of music. Now, I talked about before with speaking music or using our voice to speak music. Now, in this case, our voice is equal to our instrument. So when I'm playing this or I'm speaking this language, in this case, I'm going to play these 3 measures, and my voice that I'm going to choose is my instrument or my guitar. So this line of music sounds like this. I'm going to play this one more time. I just want you to follow with your eyes. 2, ready, and... So again, when I'm going through this, when you're listening to pitch, the lower the note is on the staff, the lower the sound is, or the lower the pitch. The higher the note is written on the staff, the higher the pitch is. And each one of these notes, instead of drawing the actual letter name on the line or space, we have these note heads. But this is how I go about naming these notes, as I figure out first, is it on a line or space? Then the number of that line or space, and then using this strategy by using these acronyms, Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge, or FACE within the spaces, I can go and name these notes. Alright, so now that we've named all of our notes on our treble clef, we're going to move on to our bass clef. So like I was talking about before, with pitch, the bass clef deals with lower pitched instruments such as the trombone, bass guitar, double bass, or tuba. All of these instruments will play, they play at lower pitches, they have a lower range, so they play off of the bass clef. Now, just like the treble clef, the bass clef has fixed position notes, which means that every note that we use on the bass clef, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, they have a fixed position, which means that if I write a note here, or if I write a note here, it will always have the same name no matter what. So within our bass clef, the note names actually change, but the lines and spaces stay the same. So I'll show you what I mean. I still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines in the bass clef, and I still have 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces. So just like in the treble clef, I can use acronyms to remember what my note names are. And let me just write out my note names really quick. So I have A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And in this case, in my bass clef, the notes are as follows. So I have a G, B, this note is a D, this is an F, and this is an A on my top line. In my spaces, I have A, C, E, and G. So those acronyms that I can use to remember the names of my notes in my lines and in my spaces. So later when I am reading full music charts, I can look at that note and I can figure it out really, really quickly. I use these sayings. So I have G, good, B, burritos, D, don't, F, fall, A, apart. And it's true, good burritos don't fall apart. And then in the spaces, I have A, C, E, and G. And I can use this. All cows eat grass. So again, when I'm naming these notes, I can go to my lines or my spaces and say I had something that looked kind of like this. So I'd go, again, I'd count my lines or I'd count my spaces. I'd always start at the bottom. So let me just put my stems on quick. So I'd go 1, 2. I know that this is on my second line. If I go back here, it's burritos. So I know that this is a B. I go up here. This is on my 1, 2. This is on my third line. I go here, 1, 2, 3. This is a D, so I know that this is a D. All the way to the top, this is on a space, so I go 1, 2, 3. It's on my fourth space. I go over here, this is a G. And here, this is on my first space. back here, all, this is an A. So again, B, D, G, A. And talking with pitch, I know that my pitch starts low, gradually gets higher, and then drops back down again. So again, the faster you're able to look at these notes, name them, the faster that you can put these notes onto your instrument, and the faster you can get playing music.